numerous local and regional actors, each of them jockeying for influence and trying to help destroy the imperial states that exist in the region. And what I mean by these numerous actors is that what we do not have in any condition of decolonization is a single national body overthrowing some faraway imperial state. We always have competition at local levels, and we actually almost always have competition between the empires as well. And so we have a multi-actor scenario, and this is definitely also present here in Eastern Europe in the last decade before the end of the war. I try to identify three particular phases of decolonization in the book. The first is what I call Imperial Challenge, and this would encompass a lot of what we already understand about, let's say, the development of nationalism in Eastern Europe. Definitely the evolution of political parties that seek national independence are part of an imperial challenge. But imperial challenges can happen within the metropole as well, within the core capital cities, by people that begin to doubt whether empire is such a good idea for the empire itself. And again, this is an extremely common form of challenge that happens to empires, especially in their waning days. The second phase, for me, is the most important one, and this is the phase of state failure. I think it's too often overlooked that at any time when you get a transfer of power from an empire into a decolonizing moment, you're going to have a moment of state failure and of state collapse. The replacement of one state by another, or more frequently by many others. I think often revolutionaries fall prey to the idea that, well, once we take the top level of power, once we seize the commanding heights, we're going to be able to make the state bureaucracy function as it had done before. So all that we'll need to do is to launch our coup, take over the government, and then we will have the government for us to do what we will. But of course, states are much more complex than that. They rely on many more sources of authority and of networks of power, and those networks of power disintegrate when the old imperial state disintegrates. State failure then quite often leads into social disaster. And the reason for this, of course, is that as the monopoly on legitimate violence disappears, you get new entrepreneurs of violence who are able to exert power based on their proficiency in the art of violence itself, but maybe not their proficiency in governing a local society or managing an economy or doing many of the other things that would provide peace or prosperity for a society that is undergoing this particular process. So that broadly is what the framework is. I start the book actually with a brief section on the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. And the reason that I do that is that I think actually one of the things that makes World War I so explosive is that at the same moment that you have this intense imperial competition, that is to say, competition between the great empires themselves, something that's been a part of the World War I literature since World War I itself began, we also have this key moment of the maturation of this first phase of European decolonization through Serbia, really. I mean, I think it's really in the Balkans, but especially through Serbia, that we have this mature moment of decolonization. And in the Balkans, in contrast to what's going to happen in the Russian Empire, what we see is that we have decolonization leading to war. In 1912, for sure, the formation of the Balkan League is intended to create a war. It's intended to push the Ottomans off of the Balkan Peninsula. It's a union of these Baltic states in order to accomplish this. And it's more or less self-avowedly decolonizing, right? The end of empire and the creation of these new national states. The Second Balkan War, for many people, is more challenging, right? The conflict between those Baltic states themselves, in particular between Serbia and Bulgaria, that many people at the time read as a certain level of immaturity on the part of these Balkan states, that they were just scrambling over the scraps of victory. But really what we're seeing here is, again, a very common 20th century phenomenon, which is the attempt to establish regional hegemony in a phase of decolonization. And again, you can see this in many places in Africa and in Asia in the periods in which empires withdraw. So I see the Balkans here as being part of this story. In the Russian Empire, by contrast, it's war that leads to decolonization. And this is going to take place really over the period from 1914 to 1921, to in some areas really up until the into the mid 1920s. As in the Balkans, the Imperial Challenge was taking place in many of these areas. This is a map from my colleague Eric Lohr's book, and the striped regions here are the regions that get put under martial law, and I'm going to discuss why martial law zones are so important for this question here early in the war. But we have plenty of places where imperial challenges are taking place. We have, of course, a quite robust and mature Polish national movement. We have challenges to empire in Armenia, in Finland, in Ukraine, all over the region, really. There are movements which are challenging the right of the Russian Empire to rule in these territories. But what's different here is that in 1905, many of these actors had indeed been actively involved in the convulsion, in the revolution that had occurred in these regions, and the Russian state had proved successful. That is to say, the revolution was put down, independence movements were not successful, and indeed we have a much reinvigorated Russian nationalism now at the heart of this ever stronger Russian Empire. And you have a real sense of despair on the part of many Eastern European nationalists that they're actually going to live long enough to see any of their cherished dreams come true. Many of them are quite pessimistic about the future, precisely because the Russian army is so strong. And indeed, many of them say, really, the only thing that is going to allow us to achieve independence is if all of the great empires start to fight one another. That is to say, if Germany and Russia come to blows, that's the only chance that we, let's say as Polish nationalists, have for national independence. And of course, that is what comes to pass in 1914. So how is it then that these people who want to challenge the empire, who want to decolonize in 1914, actually begin gaining power in the context of the war itself? Ironically, the single greatest event that is going to allow this to happen, especially in Poland, but to some degree in Ukraine as well, is taken by the Tsar himself, by Tsar Nicholas II, and is taken on the very first day of the war. And as I've suggested, it's the establishment of martial law, not just in the immediate frontline zones, but as you can see, quite deep into imperial territory. These are zones in which the army has taken supreme control over civilian governance. And so supposedly the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, all of the policemen, customs officers, all those folks are supposed to report up a chain of command that eventually will end at general headquarters, or Stavka. There are a number of problems with this decree, which is ill thought out. The number one problem is that there is no office for civilian administration at general headquarters when this is issued. It takes them a month to do this, and when they do, they appoint a grand total of 6 people to it. So you have 6 people technically in control of a territory that's larger than Germany. This obviously means that they're doing very little governing at Stavka, and if you look at the archival files, you will see that they are mainly reactive and just trying to deal with all the many problems that come their way. Well, maybe the previous officials are continuing to rule. As I suggested before, this is the hope, actually, of these military revolutionaries, that the old state will continue to function even when you take it over. Well, no. Most of the people that are in this area, let's say you're a customs official in Poland. What do you do in the first week of the war when you see the German army forming on one border and the Russian army forming behind you, and you and your little customs post on the border? Well, you take off, and many of them do. Most of them do. They go to Warsaw first, and then they flee again in 1915. But the same goes for many gendarmes. The same goes for people up and down the political ladder. And these are the people that have actually experience in administering imperial territories, that have experience dealing with these multi-ethnic populations and the political disputes that are present among them. So if the old government has left and the military hasn't established a new government, who is it that actually governs these territories? Because it's not also, I should add, it's not the active army. They're largely concerned with trying to fight their war, and they have little time for civilian administration. Well, what ends up happening is you have creation of what are called local resident committees. And this is especially acute in Poland. These are local notables who form together that say, okay, we're going to provide fire protection. We're going to provide market regulation. We're going to inspect goods at markets. We're going to provide police protection. We're going to, in other words, provide local government. And who runs these local resident committees? Well, within weeks, they have joined together basically to form a whole network of these, and they're run by Roman Dmowski and the Endek Party, actually, by Polish nationalists, basically take over local governance in all of these regions. And so even before the Great Retreat from Poland in 1915, Russian Poland is basically being governed by Polish nationalists. This is just one indication of the way that the war begins to change events really at the ground level throughout the Russian Empire. This is also part of the larger process of what I'm calling state failure. And indeed, the institution of martial law is the signal moment for the beginning of this process of state failure. I'm able, obviously, to trace this in greater detail in the book, but what we're seeing happening over the course of 1914, 1915 are the collapse of many of the different forms of governance that the imperial state had provided over the previous 300 years. And with it, a lot of the security that local residents have. Let me take just one example from all of this, and it has to do with the economy. Wars obviously often have a devastating effect upon the economy in regions in which the armies are acting. And we should remember that the war zone of the Eastern Front in World War I is taking place largely within this colonial space, indeed almost entirely within this former colonial space in which empires had been governing. If you were to do, let's say, a battlefield tour today of World War I battlefields, on the Eastern Front, you wouldn't find any of them really in, very few of them, a couple in Germany, of course, none in Russia, but you'd find a whole lot in Ukraine, in Poland, in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Belarus. Those are the places where you're going to find the major battlefields of the Eastern Front. And so the war affects all of these regions, but it affects it more than just the destruction that the armies moving through them sort of produce. The other way that the war helps affect this is because the military, and quite soon the state, takes on a much more aggressive form of ethno politics, in particular in aggressive actions towards Germans and towards Jews. And what this accomplishes is an evisceration, actually, of a multi-ethnic imperial economy. Because the imperial economy before the war had been stratified not only by class, but also by ethnicity. And so Jews, forbidden to own land in many of these regions, were small traders in many parts of in the shtetls across this territory. There were many German factory owners and land owners. And so when you take entire ethnic groups out of this economy, you're taking actually building blocks out of this economy too. And this helps produce a lot of the collapse that we're seeing. In addition, the people that then try to provide some sort of economic guidance have no idea what they're doing with the economy. So for instance, one of the things that Jews get arrested for in Warsaw in the first year of the war is for speculation. And what they're accused for speculation for is because they have warehouses that are full of goods, let's say sugar. Well, of course you have to have a warehouse full of sugar. You have to actually store it before you can sell it. And indeed, many of them had pulled goods out of the regions in which the war was being fought. But this was enough cause for the military authorities then to move in and say, no, you're saving this for a later date. We're going to arrest you at a later date. You're going to sell it for a higher price. You're going to be a speculator. And therefore, we're going to arrest you. All of the people in the economy, Poles, Jews, Germans, said, oh no, you can't, if you start prosecuting people for having warehouses, you're really going to put the economy in a lot of trouble, but the army actually doesn't listen to them. And so people stop warehousing. They liquidate all of their goods. They flood the market with all these goods. The army starts buying things with requisitioning scrip. This is fake money, right? All of this together, if you issue a bunch of not only new rubles, but also fake money, and also have people flood the market with their goods all at one time, you're going to have a great deal of inflation. And that's exactly what occurs, and it becomes the number one economic problem in the Russian Empire from 1914 until the end of the war. If you read soldier letters home and the letters of their families back, almost every letter is filled with a discussion of how they're going to survive inflation. And again, inflation was going to happen no matter what in this war, but the Russian army policies made it much, much worse. And so we have economic collapse now combining with the increased lack of security and just the lack of state institutions more generally. In 1915, all of this sort of comes to a head with the great, what the Russian historiography calls the Great Retreat, the massive retreat from all of this territory here that starts with the Battle of Gorlice Tarnów in the spring and concludes with the successful Svientsyany offensive in September of 1915 that pushes the line from that dark blue to the dotted blue line there, which is to say the acquisition of this territory by the Central Powers of basically all of Russian Poland, about half of Latvia, a good chunk of Lithuania, a large part of Western Belarus, and obviously a significant chunk of Ukraine as well. So this is the conquest of this zone. I spent a lot of time talking about 1915 in the book, and again, I'm only able to sort of skip over a little bit of it now. But there was reason, I think, for many to believe, as a result of these military disasters, that significant changes would occur in Russia. Indeed, that maybe the revolution might come in 1915 rather than as it does in 1917. And one of the reasons for this is that this isn't just a military catastrophe. It's a social catastrophe as well. In the midst of this retreat, we have an intensification of that radical form of ethnopolitics that I was talking about before. So if in 1914 you would have hundreds of Jews arrested for suspicion of spying and deported to Siberia, now entire communities are being expelled en masse, basically. And so you have a ratcheting up of this process of ethnopolitics. Lynchings become much more common. And you also have just a greater degree of forced migration as well. Some of this is forced migration that's directed by the Russian army. They institute a scorched earth policy, which many army commanders interpret to mean they have to move everyone out of the war zone. And so they will bundle up whole Polish communities and try to drive them further east in the midst of this. Other army corps interpret this slightly differently, but still people flee there because they want to avoid, obviously, being in a frontline zone. The outcome of this is internal migration on a vast scale. By 1917, there are 6 million internal refugees in the Russian Empire, and it's a catastrophic situation. Much of it coming from this moment in 1915, and this brings fears of social disintegration and fears of revolution and fears of the spread of epidemic disease all over the empire, again, here in the summer of 1915. And this is leading to an even further intensification of the political crisis that's going on in the center of Russia at the same time. This is a slide that's taken in St. Petersburg, actually, upon the declaration of war in 1914. And this is taken as the visible symbol of the unity of the Tsar and of the people. And it gets interpreted, as it does in France, as a sacred union between the moment in which all the political parties agree to put their differences aside and to pursue the war effort and to support the Tsar and to fight to a glorious conclusion. It is this moment, this pictorial moment that gets broken in 1915. And it happens very quickly after the first military defeats. The defeat at Gorlice Tarnów becomes evident really within the first few days of May. And already by the end of May, there are significant calls for change. On the 24th of May, the newspaper Utro Rassi calls for a government of national defense. On the 26th of May, the Congress of Industry and Trade Representatives call for a constituent assembly or contemplate such a call, but then settle for a demand to reconvene the Duma, the parliament. On the same day, massive anti-German riots erupt in Moscow on May 26. a little more than, or I should say just about a week later, there are now massive strikes in the central industrial region in the city of Kostroma. You're starting to see the reemergence of all the things that the government had hoped to put away at the beginning of the war. A revival of labor activism, a revival of political oppositionism, a re-energizing of the moderates and the radicals to the left of the Russian political spectrum. And so this is a summer of great ferment in St. Peter's, in Petrograd, over the course of the summer of 1915. People are trying to figure out how to save the war effort and also accomplish their own political goals. And the solution is a remarkably wide-based, what gets called the Progressive Bloc. And the Progressive Bloc is a coalition not only of parties, but of actors really across the political spectrum, from the moderate right to the moderate socialists. It's so expansive that it gains a majority even in the conservative state council. It's so, again, it's so expansive that all but one of the ministers in the Council of Ministers agree to support it when it comes before them. Unfortunately, the one minister who doesn't agree is the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Ivan Garemykin. And when he goes to meet individually with the Tsar on the 29th of August, he persuades the Tsar to reject the Progressive Bloc. And the Progressive Bloc really is, in many ways, quite progressive. They're asking for not only a much greater, an expansion of opportunity within the political system for all of these other political parties, but also, for instance, for an end to ethnic discrimination, an end to anti-Semitism, which had been a very volatile issue that became a plank of the Progressive Bloc. And again, you're getting even people in the right of Russian politics agreeing to this in order to save the war effort. The Tsar, however, rejects it and disbands the Duma, fires many of his moderate ministers, and begins issuing some of the laws that he wanted to pursue by decree instead. The moment he starts to do this, you start to see riots again. The very first law he tries to promulgate is actually a new expansion of military conscription, and when these happen, you get riots all over the country. And yet, you don't get revolution in 1915, and I think it's an interesting question why it doesn't occur. I think it certainly could have. But it doesn't occur in late 1915, and it doesn't occur in 1916 either. And so what I try to do in this phase of the book largely goes chronologically, what I try to do in the chapters on 1916 is to try to describe actually what's happening here in the year and a half between this huge political crisis in the summer of 1915 and the February Revolution in 1917. What's holding the empire apart? What's holding the empire together? And what are the forces that are pulling it apart? I've already discussed many of the forces that are pulling it apart. The state is in the process of failing or collapsing in the borderlands, and that process is now extending further into the center of the empire. What, however, is holding it together? Well, I argue that, as in many other European countries, there's a process of remobilization that occurs in the middle of World War I. The initial mobilizations that had carried all of the belligerent states to war and through the first few months had exhausted itself within a couple of years, and all European states have to come to terms with this and have to remobilize in certain ways in the middle of the war in order to continue fighting it. In Russia, this happens both in the military and in society. The military actually sees quite a significant rebound in 1916. They have a number of successful campaigns. The most famous one, the man I have on the slide behind me here, Brusilov's offensive in 1916 in Galicia, is one of the more successful campaigns outside of the the Central Powers campaign in the summer of 1915. But if you're going to compare what happens, let's say, with Brusilov with what happens on the Somme basically at the same time, Brusilov is a lot more successful. You see similarly Yudenich having a tremendous amount of success in eastern Anatolia, and they have initial success with a campaign in Persia as well that begins to come apart, but I won't go into all the details, but come apart because they're persuaded to try to help the British relieve their siege in Iraq, and that goes badly, and then the Persian campaign begins to go badly as well. But the upshot of this is that the Russian army has begun to do things differently in 1916 than it had done in 1914, and they're beginning to see success as a result. Similarly, we have new forces that are changing the way that society is operating and that social organization is happening in the midst of 1916. And I put these under the larger category of progressives as well. Not just to link them with the progressive bloc in 1915, obviously, but also to link them more generally with other progressive movements in other countries. And by progressives, I mean not only people who are looking out for a particular kind of sort of left-wing populist view on politics, but also that they're technocratic, that they're intrusive, that they want to use the state for positive ends, but they want a stronger, more intrusive state as a result. The social groups I study in the book to help demonstrate this largely have to do with the field of medicine. I look at doctors and at nurses and at campaigns to control epidemic diseases. And here you can really see, for instance, if you were to ask who's most likely to check your ID card and conduct surveillance on you if you're on a train in the frontline zone, it's actually not military counterintelligence, and it's not even people searching for deserters in 1916. You're much more likely to get checked by a doctor because they're trying to prevent anyone with an epidemic disease from getting to the center of the empire. And they set up a whole system of disinfection points and of quarantine hospitals and a whole series of other things. They engage in large-scale inoculation campaigns with their soldiers. And this is just part of a brand of progressive politics that is actually present elsewhere in the Russian state as well. I don't discuss it much in the book, but 1916 is also when you see the emergence of an income tax in Russia. I mean, all of these sort of cardinal moments for progressives are actually coming to fruition for Russia here. So what we're seeing in 1916 is a race against time, really. The attempt of military and social progressives to try to build a new Russian system while the old one is collapsing. And the question is the collapse going to go faster, or is this rebuilding process going to go faster? The answer to that question, as we all know, is that the collapse runs faster. And this is in part because progressives are a relatively small group within the Russian political sphere, most notably within the highest tiers. The Tsar never adopts progressive ideas. We saw in 1915. In 1916, he became even more hostile to them, puts many of the people who are actually building hospitals and quarantining soldiers under surveillance because he suspects them of sedition. Not unreasonably, actually, many of their congresses, they're talking about ways to change the government. But what we get by obviously the February 1917 is a situation in which the Tsar has completely run out of political capital. And the first major rebellion against his rule, led by the women of Petrograd, is enough to topple the regime. Now, at every moment in this revolution, soldiers play a major role. They play a major role. Enlisted soldiers play a major role in the events, in the street events in Petrograd in February themselves. It's the chief of the the chief at Stavka, Mikhail Alexeyev, who persuades the Tsar to abdicate. And crucially, the military continues to play an enormous role in the first months of the revolution itself. So not only with the establishment of Order Number 1 and the creation of soldier committees, that is to say, the revolution within the army itself and the idea that you're going to be able to elect your officers, but they also begin to take an active role in the way that a new Russia is going to be conceptualized and created. And the part that I'm most interested in this book has to do with questions of empire, as you might have guessed by now. And really, I think it's the soldier activity here in early 1917 that in many respects proves decisive. There's a huge debate within Russian political circles about what's going to happen basically with the empire and with the question of the Russian state more generally, obviously, after the revolution. It's the soldiers that continue to insist that the new state be anti-imperial. And the slogan that they organize around is peace without annexations or indemnities. Peace without annexation or indemnities. What does this slogan mean for them? Well, this slogan means that they're willing to defend the Rodina, they're willing to defend the homeland and continue to defend it, especially early in 1917. They're not defeatists, and they are not all fleeing from the front the moment that the revolution happens in February. They believe that German power is dangerous for them, and they want to forestall it. But they want to have, they don't want to fight for the Russian Empire either. And this, of course, comes to a head in April when Pavel Milyukov, the head of the Liberal Constitutional Democratic Party, is exposed as continuing to fight for imperial war aims, notably the acquisition of the Straits at the end of the war. And again, it's soldier protests that really help bring him down, force him to resign, and expose that the problem of empire really at the heart of the Russian system. You're going to see it again actually in the summer of 1917, and this is the moment where I really see the levee breaking in terms of decolonization. It has to do with the June offensive, which takes place largely within Ukraine. The idea among many in the center, including Kerensky, who's by now prime minister, is the idea is that they're going to have one last big offensive to solidify the army, to fight for Allied war aims, and this is going to keep Russia in the war and help sustain the revolution as well. It turns out that the soldiers are not willing to fight for that, and indeed, quite soon after the offensive starts, many units say, we are not fighting for any more new territory, by which they mean territory in Ukraine, really. Because they're in Ukraine, they get engaged with the entire Ukrainian political ferment of 1917, which, again, I'm able to discuss more in the book than I am here today. But this is an extremely volatile mix of politics and military affairs in June and July of 1917. And it turns out badly for empire. All of it does. The offensive fails and the army begins to dissolve. And as the army dissolves, we begin to see a much wider spectrum of political activity. Here is when we really start to see movement towards national independence gaining ground in late 1917 and into 1918. And again, it's largely as a result of what's happened in the summer of 1917, rather than the February Revolution itself. If you look early in 1917, it's actually kind of a federal moment. Many of the, if you look at even among nationalist groups in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of people pressing for federation. Actually, federalism is a quite popular slogan and idea for many people in this time period. It's only as you get to the end of the year that independence becomes to seem more and more realistic and then more and more inevitable. And so, by late 1917 into 1918, first in Finland, then in Ukraine, and then in rapid succession elsewhere, you start to see independence movements forming and succeeding. So Finland gets its independence. Ukraine declares its independence so that it can participate in the Brest-Litovsk peace process, and that's in early January 1918. As 1918 proceeds, decolonization takes its own force just with the process of state collapse. So I end really the core part of my book in August of 1918 when the Bolsheviks lose the city of Kazan on the Volga River. This is where many scholars see the Russian Empire having begun under Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, and it seemed a fitting place to mark the end of the Russian Empire in August of 1918. Now, I do have an epilogue in which I talk about the way that actually the Bolsheviks retake the city a month later, and then the process of the reformation of the Russian Empire takes place. But I think this is a different process. The kind of empire the Soviets build is a different sort of empire than the one that they replaced, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in questions and answers if people like. But one of the things to understand is that in the midst of the Russian Civil War, and again, this has been widely understood, what we have is not so much a process of a successful empire building between 1918 and 1921, but of particular political maneuverings within the context of state failure and especially social disaster. It's what we see in the lands of the former Russian Empire between 1918 and 1921, famines, epidemics, the slaughter of civilians, multi-headed war, all of these sorts of things, again, they're not unknown in other decolonizing zones after World War II. And I think they share many of the same structuring features. To take, again, just one example, ethno-political violence, which I've hinted at a couple of times in this talk, it worsens still. I mean, if it's bad when you have the pogroms, let's say in 1903, and then it's terrible in 1915 in the midst of the Great Retreat, it gets even worse in 1919 in Ukraine, where between 1918 and 1920, there are more than 1,500 pogroms in 1,300 towns, with total deaths of somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 people. So the scale of catastrophe is sometimes difficult to describe, and that's one of the reasons I think that World War I has gotten less attention in the Russian case, is that the war that follows it is actually much more destructive and much more savage even than the Great War had been. So what we see over the course of the Russian Civil War is a state that has completely fractured, has completely splintered, and leads to what I've called in another context sort of the rise of the Russian warlords. And warlordism is an understandable phenomenon. It's what happens when you get that process of violent entrepreneurship I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And so you have people like Makhno in Ukraine or Semyonov in Siberia. These are people that control sometimes large amounts of territory, but often with heavy hands and with a lot of reprisals against civilians. You did not want to be a townsperson in Mongolia while Ungern Sternberg was there. These were times when people were quite destructive. So how do you get out of this? How do you move from this process of state collapse and social disaster? Put another way, how is it that you build a post-colonial state? And how do you do it in Eastern Europe? And why are some people successful and others not? There are, of course, examples of states that are constructed in this period, again, in periods of war. I mean, Pilsudski's Poland is a good example of this. But also Trotsky, who I think we can see as a warlord like Makhno and Semyonov for large parts of the Russian Civil War. He conducted himself in much the same way and used many of the same tactics. But there was something different about Trotsky from Makhno and from Semyonov. And I think this is best highlighted by the fact that as the wars ground to a close, he sought to become the commissar for industry, for heavy industry in the Soviet Union. And this is something that none of these other warlords would have ever contemplated. There's no way that Semyonov or Ungern Sternberg would have ever lowered themselves to be the head of an industrial commissariat. These were military men. And so Trotsky's position I think is indicative not only of the difference between Trotsky and what we might call a traditional warlord, but also in some of the ways that why the Bolsheviks were successful over some of these other folks. Because while warlords can be quite successful in given circumstances, the modern state has proven able to defeat warlords over and over again. And so the process of successful state building is really what we need to look for as we look into in the Russian circumstance here in the Russian Civil War. So, unfortunately, my lecture is largely about disaster and destruction, as I promised you at the beginning, and less about the successful processes of state building and the building of social cohesion. But I think it's useful to actually think about the Soviet Union not only as a revolutionary state, not only as a communist state, but also in certain respects as a post-colonial state, plagued with many of the problems that post-colonial states have had in terms of the infrastructure in which they inherit, and also in terms of the levels of social cohesion, economic strength, and other things that many post-colonial societies and post-colonial states have struggled with in many different circumstances. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.